We need to protect our interests and the interest of our allies, and you can only do that by holding Iran accountable for their illegal acts in supplying the Houthis with these weapons.
Welcome back to Israel's multi-front threats, our interview series examining the complex and growing security challenges facing Israel. Today, we are reminded that threats to Israel are threats to America. The Iranian-backed Houthi terrorists in Yemen have become one of Tehran's most dangerous proxies, armed with advanced drones and ballistic missiles. Their attacks have targeted Israeli civilians and most recently 2 U.S. Navy warships. The message is clear. The Houthis are not just a regional threat, they are a direct danger to American forces and global security. To help us understand the scope of this evolving threat, we're joined by Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery. Admiral Montgomery is the Senior Director of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. His distinguished 32-year naval career includes service as a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer and commander of Carrier Strike Group 5. Admiral Montgomery, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Admiral, Yemen sits along one of the world's most strategic waterways, the Bab al-Mandab Strait. Can you explain the significance of this area for international commerce and security and how the Houthis threaten it?
Yes, and it's really interesting because I think most people don't quite understand what a large percentage of world trade goes through the Red Sea. So it's about 13% of world trade, about 25% of world shipping, about 20% of world crude oil and liquid natural gas all go through the strait. So when the strait has problems, you have to route around it. It can really cause problems for the world economy. In other words, to route around the Strait of AlMandab is about a 40% increase in the length of transit around Africa. And that'll increase the cost of any kind of shipping about 15%. And to give you an idea how much, when I say 25% of world shipping goes through there, that's about $1 trillion a year worth of shipping that suddenly is going to have a 15% excise task on it, due to paying for fuel to go around Africa. So the Strait of AlMandab is a very important strait to not just to Europe, but to the world trading system.
Yeah, and you mentioned the impact on trade, but just recently the Houthis carry out a highly sophisticated drone and missile attack against 2 U.S. Navy ships. This is a significant escalation. Can you tell us more about what this attack means, and as someone who's commanded U.S. Navy ships, what it's like in the moment for these crews to respond to an attack?
So we've had Navy ships since October, before October 7th, but really in good numbers after October 7th in the Straits to protect international shipping going through. And, there's a couple allies with us, but it's basically the United States and the United Kingdom, with the U.S. doing almost all the shooting. And we've been shooting down cruise and ballistic missiles coming in. These ships have also shot down ballistic missiles and cruise missiles headed towards Israel when they're in the right position. They're able to do that as well. So there've been a little bit that's about Israel, but mostly it's been about the Straits. You mentioned an interesting case recently. A very complex attack was made against 2 U.S. Navy ships. Now, in the past, there have been scores of missiles shot at U.S. Navy ships that were shot down, cruise and ballistic. But in this case, this was a mixture of modern cruise and ballistic missiles timed to arrive on top and complicate the fire control systems on these 2 ships. Luckily, these are both very modern Aegis destroyers, probably the only 2. They're of a class of ships that a handful of countries have that can handle this kind of complex attack, and they did engage all the missiles. But I'll tell you, we've been I know we have good systems and good sailors, but at some point we've also had good luck. We have to be very careful. Luck, as we all know, eventually runs out. And so we've been observing the Houthis get more and more complex. As they do, eventually they will hit a U.S. Navy ship and cause casualties for the United States, much like the IRGC did, in Jordan a year ago now with a drone attack.
Yeah, and earlier this month, Pentagon officials even expressed shock at Houthis' current capabilities. They've gone from a small ragtag terror group to a serious global threat. Can you tell us a little bit about how this happened, where they're getting their weapons, their money, and training?
Yeah, thanks. And I'm surprised they're shocked. And I think the Israelis would be surprised they're shocked because there's one reason the Houthis have good systems, and that's Iran. Now, look, like in all these cases with beleaguered democracies, whether it's Ukraine or Israel or Taiwan or South Korea, you're not fighting one country anymore. Ukraine is fighting Russia, but also North Korea with its troops and its artillery rounds, Iran with its Shahed drones that it's given the Russians, and China, backstopping the economy. In the same way, I think Israel understands after October 7th. Iran is their proximate aggressor. But Iran is backstopped by North Korea, Russia, and China. And I think we've seen that recently with reports of North Korean weapons getting to Hezbollah, an IRGC front piece. So it's Iran. Iran is giving increasingly complex systems to the Houthis. And these are both ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, but also drones. And they're getting more and more complex and modern. It's bad for the merchant ships, really terrible for the merchant ships, and it's bad for the U.S. Navy.
Yeah, and I think you make a great point with this new power dynamic, power triangle between Russia, China, and Iran. And they've really helped the Houthis improve their capabilities. And speaking of those, it's become clear that the Houthis have not been deterred from directly attacking American troops, commercial ships, as you've mentioned. How would you define current U.S. policy towards the Houthis? And looking forward, what options are there for policymakers?
So I would say that we are practicing deterrence by denial in the Red Sea, which means we're shooting down everything coming at us, and we're attacking in a very specific way, launch points, kind of in a whack-a-mole system. So we've spent more than $2 billion in defensive weapons and offensive weapons doing this. It's not successful. The way you deter the Houthis is you hold Iran accountable for its role supporting the Houthis. And the way you do that is you have to strike the Iranian supply chain going into Yemen. But you've got to hold Iran accountable. They are fighting the United States and Israel, and they're using the Houthis as surrogates, just like they use the IRGC surrogates in Syria and Iraq, just like they used Hezbollah, and just as in the recent past, they've used Hamas. This is a conflict with Iran, and in the end, you will only deter the Houthis by deterring Iran.
So you mentioned a number of different options or strategies. Do you envision the future administration taking any of those actions, or how will the future Trump administration differ from current policy from the Biden administration?
Well, I think there'll be quite a few changes, and some we'll like and some we won't. But I mean, in this area, I believe they'll do a better job holding Iran accountable. They certainly held the IRGC accountable for killing Americans in Iraq with the death of General Soleimani back in 2021. And I think we're going to have to take this kind of hardline approach again. I think Israel showed the way a couple of weeks ago with their attacks into Iran. Look, U.S. F-35s, U.S. B-2 bombers can operate with relative ease over Iran. We can strike the targets I'm talking about. Frankly, we can do it from standoff ranges like the Israelis did in some cases. And we can also penetrate and strike if we need to. This is something we need to do. We're a big country. We need to protect our interests and the interests of our allies. We need to protect world trade because we benefit the most from world trade. And you can only do that by holding Iran accountable for their illegal acts and supplying the Houthis with these weapons.
How can the United States work with Israel to strengthen their defenses and take on Iran and its terrorist proxies?
Well, I think, first of all, both countries recognize now. I think the United States has a clear view on Iran than it did 2 years ago. I think we've always held Iran to be an adversary, but clear that their intentions are much more accelerated than we might have hoped. I think equally, Israel has come to understand that China and Russia have no good to play. And since October 7th, they've made hard decisions that I think will, in the long term, firmly sit Israel and the United States as opposing all four of those countries and their authoritarian desires. And the United States needs to support Israel in this effort. Part of it's the supplemental, delivering weapon systems as agreed upon in last year's supplemental, and that's happening. And these are the important air-to-ground and ground-to-ground munitions, artillery, tank rounds, and then air-to-ground 500,000-pound, 2,000-pound weapons. But we also have to continue our support to the Iron Dome projects, the Iron Beam project, and Arrow projects. In other words, reinforce those. I think temporally we put a THAAD battery there. I don't think that's a permanent deployment. There's just not enough THAAD batteries to go around unless we were to permanently station one there, which we're not going to do. So from my perspective, it's continue to provide this logistic support, this munition support. It's to continue to support them with intelligence. We have a very rich intelligence sharing agreement with the Israelis. And it's, having strong political support for each other as we work in international organizations, but also when we confront very specifically Iran, China, Russia, and North Korea for their aberrant behavior towards beleaguered democracies like Israel.
Yeah, and pulling back a little bit from just U.S.-Israel cooperation in terms of Israel's defense, is there a role for our Arab allies? Is there somewhere where they fit into this strategy?
Look, we all know there's no love lost between, the Arabs who are in the Abraham Accords and probably throw Saudi Arabia in as well, towards Iran. Iran has both territorial and kind of hegemonistic ambitions over the Arab countries, and they recognize that. So I do believe that, a continued effort to expand the Abraham Accords to include Saudi Arabia is a very important next step. It's one that I think President Trump would want to and is up to achieving. I think he has a better relationship with Mohammed bin Salman than the Biden administration does, so he might be able to achieve that. I do think there's work there. I think the next big step is getting Saudi Arabia more directly involved.
Well, Admiral Montgomery, thank you for being with us today and sharing your insights, and thank you for your long service to our country.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Zach.
Israel is fighting a multi-front war against Iran and its terrorist proxies. Our work to ensure Israel has the tools needed to defend against these threats to both Israel and America is more vital than ever. Please visit AIPAC.org/act to contact your members of Congress and urge them to stand with Israel. Thanks, and see you next time.